It was a blisteringly hot day in August, 1589, and the last king of the Valois dynasty lay dying in a bed soaked with his own blood. His reign wasn't ending with triumph or fanfare, but with the sharp thrust of an assassin's knife. Henry III of France had lived unlike any monarch before him, wrapped in silk, dripping in pearls, always surrounded by beautiful young men, and boldly rejecting every traditional idea of what a king should be. His assassination didn't just end a life. It slammed shut the door on a dynasty that had ruled France for over 200 years. To the monk who stabbed him, it was divine justice. To the nobles who had abandoned him, it was long overdue payback. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. This isn't just the story of a so-called decadent king meeting his fate. It's the story of a man caught between the crushing weight of royal expectations and a powerful personal drive to live truthfully, regardless of the cost. In an era when kings were expected to radiate power, authority, and divine masculinity, Henry chose grace over aggression, beauty over bloodshed. To many of his contemporaries, Henry was the most effeminate prince in Christendom. Today, historians debate whether he was gay, gender non-conforming, or simply misunderstood, an easy target for political propaganda. But one thing is certain: Henry III lived and died on his own terms, even as those choices horrified a continent and painted a target on his back. This is the story of a king who refused to fit into the mold of royal masculinity and was murdered for it. His death wasn't just a political event, it was a symbol. The blood that spilled beneath his dying body carried the legacy of monarchs who had shaped centuries of European politics. But it also marked the beginning of something new, an era driven by religious zeal, political extremism, and a monarchy forever changed. Henry's assassination wasn't just the end of a dynasty. It was a revolution disguised as righteousness. Few royal deaths were as anticipated, celebrated, or frankly, predictable as Henry III's. And yet, behind the political chaos and religious warfare that defined his reign, there was something deeply personal, a quieter, more intimate tragedy. This is the story of a man who dared to show femininity in a world that demanded masculinity and dominance, and who paid the ultimate price. That monk's blade didn't just kill a king. It closed the book on a chapter of French history, written in perfume, silk, and quiet rebellion. But before we reach that final bloody scene, we need to go back. To understand Henry III's controversial reign and his violent end, we have to return to a fractured France, where royal bloodlines carried the divine right to rule, and yet even divine mandate couldn't protect a king who defied the rules. France, in the 16th century, was a kingdom bleeding from within. It was being torn apart by brutal religious civil wars, battles between the staunch Catholic establishment and the increasingly powerful Protestant movement known as the Huguenots. These conflicts would become known as the French Wars of Religion. The Valois dynasty, which had ruled since 1328, was caught right in the middle, caught between religious dogma, noble ambition, and rising social unrest. Henry was born into this storm in 1551. He was the third son of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, a formidable queen from Florence, Italy. France was already buckling under the weight of sectarian violence when he entered the world. The Valois court was dazzling. It was a palace of Renaissance beauty and sophistication, deeply influenced by Catherine's Italian heritage. Art, fashion, and intellectual life flourished here. But beneath that glittering surface, there were dark undercurrents of political backstabbing and religious tension. Henry grew up in this strange blend of elegance and danger. As the third son, he wasn't expected to rule. That gave him more freedom than his older brothers. While they were groomed for power, Henry was allowed to explore his interests, and those interests weren't what anyone expected of a future king. He was brilliant. He learned Latin, Greek, and several modern languages with ease. But what really made him stand out was his love for fashion, jewelry, dance, and the art of performance. While his brothers were trained for war, Henry was mastering the refined rituals of court life. Then the wars began. France spiraled deeper into religious violence. Massacres, political assassinations, betrayals. These weren't just unfortunate side effects of unrest. They became the standard tools of power. Henry's mother, Catherine de' Medici, became the unofficial ruler behind the scenes. She was one of the most powerful women in Europe, and she recognized early on that her son was both brilliant and different. She admired his mind, but she worried about the way he presented himself, his ornate clothing, his close relationships with other young men. In a letter to a relative, she described him as dazzling, but perhaps too delicate for the brutal world of politics and war. Everything changed when Henry's older brothers, Francis II and Charles IX, died. With their deaths, Henry unexpectedly became the heir to the throne. That shift meant he could no longer be the free-spirited prince indulging his personal tastes. He was now expected to carry the full weight of kingship. The young man who had found joy in silk doublets and court dances was suddenly being asked to become the embodiment of France's masculine, divine monarchy. But the country he was about to inherit was a mess. Religious extremism was tearing the population apart. Noble families were openly challenging royal authority, and any sign of softness or weakness could be used against the king like a weapon. In 1573, Catherine de' Medici saw the storm coming and tried to buy time. She arranged for Henry to be elected King of Poland. It was a political move, a way to give him real royal experience while removing him from the explosive French court. To the Polish nobility, desperate for a strong Catholic ruler who could counter Russia and the Ottomans, Henry's appointment seemed promising at first. But the moment Henry set foot in Poland, things took a strange turn. Instead of arriving like a conquering king, Henry traveled with what witnesses called the most extravagant entourage ever seen. He brought dozens of young French courtiers, chosen more for their beauty than political skill. His luggage was stuffed with silks, jewels, and cosmetics. It was more like a fashion house on tour than a royal procession. At his coronation in Krakow, Henry wore flowing robes glittering with pearls. He glided through the sacred ceremony like a dancer, not a warrior. His face was subtly painted. His appearance, his whole performance, left the Polish nobles speechless. They had expected a king of martial strength. Instead, they got something closer to a living painting. Soon, Henry's court in Poland was making headlines across Europe, for all the wrong reasons. The king seemed more interested in grooming rituals, late-night salons, and the company of his favorites than in ruling. Were these relationships romantic, platonic, political? The line was blurry, and gossip ran wild. After less than 2 years, Henry's Polish experiment came to a sudden end. News arrived that his brother Charles IX had died, and Henry was now the King of France. Instead of rushing to assume his new role, he spent weeks planning an over-the-top farewell party. And when he finally left Poland, it was in the dead of night, disguised as a merchant, accompanied by only his closest favorites. He never officially abdicated or made arrangements for his successor. Polish nobles were furious. Rumors even claimed he fled dressed as a woman. Whether true or not, that rumor followed him for the rest of his life, and helped cement his image as the most scandalous king in Christendom. By the time he reached France, the legend of Henry III had already taken on a life of its own. Henry returned to France in 1574, stepping into a kingdom on the brink of collapse, and a throne already shaking beneath the weight of religious warfare and noble rebellion. He didn't sneak into Paris quietly. No, Henry made sure his re-entrance was unforgettable. His arrival was meant to project royal splendor, but it turned into a show that stunned even the most worldly of Parisians. Witnesses described a monarch who looked more like an exotic prince from a distant, dreamlike empire than the ruler of a Christian kingdom. His robes shimmered with jewels, his companions were young and strikingly beautiful, and his carriage oozed decadence. These weren't the signs of power his subjects were used to. They were signs of something unfamiliar, provocative, unsettling, and in the eyes of many, deeply inappropriate. Then came the coronation. The ceremony at Reims Cathedral, the sacred rite that was supposed to confer divine legitimacy on the king, became the first true scandal of Henry's reign. His ceremonial robes had been customized for style, not tradition. Extra silks, added pearls, and flourishes designed to dazzle rather than humble. His hair was carefully styled, and his face once again lightly made up. More than a few whispered that he looked like a noblewoman dressed up as a king. And it wasn't just the outfit. It was who stood beside him. Henry had brought his mignons, his beloved circle of handsome young favorites, from Poland, and now installed them at the heart of French royal life. These men weren't chosen for military valor or noble lineage. They were chosen for charm, grace, and elegance. They wore fine clothes, walked with courtly precision, and were showered with privileges and titles once reserved for France's most powerful noble families. To Henry, they were companions, confidants, perhaps even reflections of the beauty he wanted to embody as a monarch. To others, they were parasites, courtiers with painted faces and soft hands, symbols of everything wrong with the court. And rumors? They exploded. Were the king and his favorites lovers? Were they part of some secret cult of pleasure? Or were they just symbols, living decorations that reflected the king's obsession with beauty over strength? Whatever the truth was, perception mattered more, and the perception was damning. Henry's daily life didn't help. He spent hours each morning tending to his appearance, brushing his hair, applying cosmetics, selecting his clothing like a royal artist curating his own canvas. Foreign ambassadors took note, sending reports back home that described a monarch consumed by vanity and self-image. Henry tried to explain himself. He argued that royal dignity required a carefully maintained image, that beauty, grace, and ceremonial elegance were part of what made a king divine, that his appearance wasn't vanity, it was strategy. But his critics weren't convinced. To them, every jeweled glove, every pearl-adorned doublet, every moment spent in the company of beautiful young men was proof that Henry wasn't a real king, that he was a performer on a throne, and that France, a nation bleeding from war and religious conflict, needed a warrior, not a muse. As the political and religious tensions escalated, those whispers turned into open rage. The Catholic League, a coalition of hardline Catholic nobles and clergy, emerged as Henry's most vocal and dangerous enemy. At its center was the powerful Guise family, who used Henry's personal life as political ammunition. They painted him as a heretic, a degenerate, a ruler who had forfeited God's favor and needed to be replaced before France fell to ruin. They published pamphlets, commissioned satirical plays, and filled pulpits with sermons claiming that Henry's court was the modern-day Sodom, that his lifestyle was an offense to God, and that France was being punished for tolerating him. These messages struck a chord in a society already deeply anxious about its future. Things came to a head in 1576 during the Estates General, a grand political assembly that brought together representatives from across France to address the nation's spiraling crises. Henry, determined to assert his royal authority, arrived in all his usual splendor. His robes were magnificent, his hair was flawless, his face was powdered and calm. But it backfired. Many delegates, especially the conservative ones, were appalled. They didn't see a king ready to lead them through war and division. They saw a man dressed like a doll. Protestant delegates pointed to him as proof of Catholic moral collapse. Catholic hardliners muttered that no real king would present himself in such a way before God and country. Still, Henry tried to push back. He leaned harder into public displays of religious devotion. He joined Catholic processions, carried rosaries, fasted, even wore hair shirts under his silks, grim reminders of Christian penance. But even these acts were dismissed as hollow theater. To his critics, it wasn't faith. It was a fashion show. Internationally, the situation was just as grim. Foreign leaders who might have once supported France began to distance themselves. Spanish diplomats reported to Philip II that the French king seemed more interested in his hair than his people. The Pope's envoys worried about the message Henry sent to the Catholic world. Back at home, Henry's court became a stage for endless scrutiny. Every event, every costume, every glance at one of his favorites became fuel for more outrage. The king's court ballets, lavish spectacles where he and his favorites danced in costumes that blurred gender lines, were attended by noble spies and foreign ambassadors alike. These ballets, designed to showcase refinement and artistic mastery, were instead used as evidence that Henry was a monarch in decline, surrounded by vice and delusion. The whispers soon became shouts. The message was clear. France needed a real king, one who hunted, rode into battle, and silenced enemies, not one who applied rouge in the mirror and choreographed dances. A growing number of nobles and priests believed the kingdom's salvation depended on Henry's removal. His very presence, they argued, was delaying God's forgiveness and prolonging France's suffering. And Henry? He didn't change. He kept his court exactly the way he wanted it. He refused to send away his favorites. He wore his pearls. He performed his ballets. He remained, stubbornly and defiantly, himself. In doing so, he drew a line in the sand, a line that would eventually be crossed with a dagger. By 1589, France was at war with itself. Henry was no longer just a king under fire. He had become the living symbol of everything the Catholic League loathed. And to them, his assassination wasn't just politically useful. It was holy. It was righteous. It was necessary. And in a darkened chamber, a fanatical Dominican monk named Jacques Clément quietly sharpened his blade. The final chapter of Henry III's life opened with a prayer and ended with a blade. France, by 1589, was a country in open collapse, ripped apart by religious civil war, shaken by assassinations, and on the brink of anarchy. And standing in the middle of it all was a king no longer merely controversial, but publicly despised by many, and targeted by religious fanatics who saw his death as an act of divine service. Jacques Clément, the man who would ultimately kill Henry, was a Dominican monk radicalized by the Catholic League's propaganda. He believed that by eliminating the king, he was purifying France. And Clément wasn't alone. Across the kingdom, Sermons declared that Henry's rule was a plague, his beauty a lie, his court a den of sin, his death the only path to redemption. The years leading up to the assassination had been a slow-motion disaster. In 1588, Henry committed one of the most shocking acts of his reign. He ordered the murder of Henry, Duke of Guise, the Catholic League's charismatic leader, and his brother, the Cardinal of Lorraine. Both were killed at the Château de Blois. The move was bold, desperate, and politically catastrophic. For many, this act solidified Henry's status as a tyrant. It confirmed every suspicion the League had been spreading for years, that the king was dangerous, corrupt, and capable of unspeakable betrayal. More than ever, Henry was isolated, abandoned by much of the nobility, alienated from the Catholic Church, and loathed by large swaths of his own people. And yet, he wasn't without support. Ironically, Henry's most crucial ally in his final years was someone who, just a decade earlier, would have been considered his natural enemy. Henry of Navarre, a Protestant prince who would later become Henry IV. The two men formed an unlikely alliance, united less by shared belief and more by shared desperation. Together, they tried to stabilize France. But it was too late. On the morning of August 1st, 1589, Clément arrived at the king's residence under the pretense of delivering secret documents. Guards allowed him into the royal chambers. Henry was seated on his bed, weakened by the stress of rule, tired from years of bloodshed, and unaware that his killer stood before him. Clément pulled a knife from beneath his robe and drove it deep into the king's abdomen. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Henry cried out. Others claim he struck back before collapsing. But what's clear is this: the blow was mortal. Clément was killed on the spot by the king's attendants, but the damage had already been done. As Henry lay dying, surrounded by a small circle of loyal supporters, he did something few expected. He named Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, as his successor. It was a final act of defiance against the League, a dying king's attempt to preserve the monarchy and prevent France from plunging into complete chaos. And then, quietly, he died. With Henry III's final breath, the Valois dynasty came to an end. A family that had ruled France for more than 2 centuries vanished in a moment of violence. But Henry's death wasn't just a dynastic turning point. It was a symbolic one. To the Catholic League, it was a victory. They had purged France of its heretical, decadent monarch. Priests across the country celebrated in their sermons. Some cities even held public festivities. The propaganda had worked so thoroughly that a king's murder could be received as divine deliverance. But history would remember it differently. As time passed, the myth of Henry III evolved. He became more than just a monarch. He became a symbol of defiance, a man who refused to hide his true self, even as the world conspired to destroy him. Some modern historians see him as a proto-queer figure, someone who challenged rigid ideas of gender and kingship centuries before such conversations were mainstream. Was he gay, gender non-conforming, a theatrical aesthete? No one can say with certainty. The records are full of contradictions, filtered through the biases and obsessions of his time. But what remains clear is this: Henry III lived with intention. He embraced beauty, ceremony, intimacy, and complexity in a world that demanded conformity, violence, and control. He didn't die just because of politics. He died because of who he dared to be. And that is what makes his story resonate even now. His reign may have been marked by scandal, instability, and war, but it was also marked by courage. Not the courage of battlefield glory, but the quieter, more dangerous courage of authenticity. He wore what he wanted, loved who he loved, redefined what power looked like. And for that, he became a target, a monarch at odds with his moment in history. But history, as we know, changes. Today, Henry III's image has been reclaimed. He's seen not as a failure, but as a figure ahead of his time. His silks and perfumes, once mocked, are now viewed as part of a deliberate state-made challenge to what kingship could be. His court, once considered a den of vice, is now recognized as one of the most artistically vibrant in Europe. And his death? His death marks not just the fall of a king, but the violent reaction of a world unwilling to accept difference. A world that chose the blade over understanding. In the centuries since, France has had many kings, many rulers, many revolutions. But few monarchs have been as fascinating or as tragic as Henry III. He didn't conquer nations. He didn't build empires. But he did something rare. He lived as himself. And in the end, maybe that's the boldest legacy a king can leave.